The next part of the brain we're going to discuss is the diencephalon, and that includes the thalamus, the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland. And I'm going to look at that in a separate subsection here because that's important enough. There's a number of pituitary disorders you should be familiar with clinically. And then the epithalamus pineal gland, and then what are called the circumventricular organs. So we're going to look at all of that in this little subsection. So the diencephalon is located above the brainstem, so just think of it sitting on top of the midbrain, and it's surrounded by the two cerebral hemispheres. And it's involved in a variety of sensory and motor processing activity. So again, all of the descending motor, ascending sensory fibers are going through this region. We also have, in addition, optic nerves that are coming in from the retinas, and they enter the diencephalon, and the optic nerves actually cross in the diencephalon. And if we kind of look at the structures, they're really focused all around the third ventricle. So the thalamus is actually, the third ventricle is sandwiched between the thalamus. And if you look at this picture down here, here you see the thalamus itself. And right in between that, in this narrow groove, is the third ventricle, actually. So the thalamus is there, and then right in front of the thalamus is the hypothalamus. And then off the back side of the thalamus is the epithalamus, and the very end of that is the pineal gland. And then you see the brainstem that this is sitting on top of, and then again the cerebellum here. So that's to give you a little orientation. So most of the diencephalon is the thalamus. Thalamus has two hemispheres, so it's two oval masses of gray matter. Again, it surrounds the third ventricle just above the midbrain, and there are 9 primary nuclei, and these are the groups of cell bodies that are going to regulate very specific functions. And the blood supply is from the posterior cerebral artery. If we look at the functions of the thalamus, it really is your sensory relay station. So it receives and filters sensory input from the body and then passes that on to the cortex. Lesions in this region can cause really horrible pain syndromes where that sensory function goes offline and you begin to feel a lot of different things from the body. In fact, we think maybe fibromyalgia is due partly to a loss of that sensory filtering in the thalamus. The former condition I spoke about, the pain syndrome, that's called thalamic pain syndrome, and that really is nearly intractable pain for a lot of people. There's some success with putting in deep electrodes into that region and just zapping those cells. Also, there's a lot of interest now in what's called transcranial magnetic stimulation, where we put electrodes around the scalp. It's non-invasive, and you create magnetic fields within the brain, and that's showing a lot of promise for pain regulation, but also depression and a number of other different disorders. The thalamus is also involved in memory and emotion. That's part of what's called the Papez circuit, which is involved in memory. And then there's also a motor relay station, so it receives input from descending fibers from the motor cortex and the basal ganglia that we spoke about. Basal ganglia can be located around the thalamus in these deeper parts of the cortex. And then it sends signals down to the descending motor tracts. And again, I mentioned the thalamic pain syndrome is something that can happen here as a result of usually a stroke to the thalamus. Here is a picture of the thalamus, and we can see it's divided into a lateral. So again, there's 2 lobes. They're actually connected via a little bridge. So the other lobe of the thalamus will be over here, and then between them is going to be the third ventricle. And so there we can divide it into a medial portion, anterior is the front portion, and then the lateral portion of the thalamus. And the geniculate bodies here are going to be involved with the optic nerve where it crosses, and it's going to actually synapse from a primary optic neuron coming from the retina. Is going to synapse onto a secondary neuron, and that's going to project back to the occipital cortex where we have our primary visual center. So here are the names of the major nuclei within the thalamus, and here's a table below just kind of summarizing what they are and what they do. Again, this is not something I'm going to have you memorize, but just know that there are these primary nuclei in the thalamus. So the ventral posterior lateral nucleus, this is a relay station for somatic sensory information from the trunk to the limbs. This is part of the input is from what's called the spinal thalamic tract and the dorsal columns, which we've already spoken about in the previous slides. And then the output from here would go to the cerebral cortex, to what's called the primary sensory cortex, where all the sensory information, conscious sensory information, is mapped. And then we have the ventral posterior medial thalamus, and that's a relay somatic sensory information from the head. And so the input's going to be from the trigeminal nerve, and kind of tracks coming up from the trigeminal nerve, and then it's going to output again to the the primary sensory cortex. Then we have the ventral lateral nucleus, and that relays motor information. So fibers going down from the motor cortex. The input's going to be from in this case, the cerebellum, in a place called the globus pallidus, and that's going to put output to the cerebral cortex, the primary motor area, so it's going to help regulate that. And then we have the ventral anterior thalamic nuclei, again relaying motor information from the cerebellum, globus pallidus, to the cerebral cortex. And then the anterior nuclei, this is involved more in emotions and memories, forming emotional memories. Again, part of what's called the Papez circuit with memory formation. The inputs are going to be from an area of the hypothalamus called the mammillary bodies, and that's going to project neurons, then will project into the limbic system, and a place called the cingulate gyrus. And then finally, the medial dorsal thalamic nuclei. This is also involved in emotions, learning, and memory. And this is going to have inputs from the prefrontal cortex, from your olfactory center, your limbic centers. And so this is how smell actually is going to be encoded with emotions and with memories. And then that's going to project fibers from there will go back to the cerebral cortex, to what's called the prefrontal association area. So again, you don't need to memorize all the inputs and outputs, but just have a little understanding of what they're doing. They're really regulating both sensory and motor information, also involved in memory and emotional formation. Okay, so that was the thalamus, major synaptic relay station between sensory information coming up from the body and then being projected into the cortex, as well as regulation of motor activity. But I think of thalamus often just with its sensory side is one of the most important aspects of it. The next structure here in the diencephalon is the hypothalamus, and that is just in front of the thalamus. So if you look at the picture over here, it's in the blue. Thalamus is over here. It's much smaller than the thalamus, but hugely important. This is your primary center where the nervous and the endocrine system are integrated, and this regulates homeostasis. It's really about the size of an almond, but again, its importance can't be underestimated. There's about a dozen nuclei here in about 4 major regions, and importantly, the hypothalamus is connected via a little stalk called the infundibulum to a gland, the pituitary gland. And the pituitary is actually sitting in the bone here of the sphenoid sinus, the sphenoid bone, I'm sorry, and it's a little indentation called the sella turcica, the Turk's saddle. It looks like one of those old Turkish saddles. So the hypothalamus is connected via the infundibulum to the pituitary. The pituitary is even smaller than the hypothalamus, the size of a pea, but again, this is your master regulatory center for pretty much your entire endocrine system. It secretes a whole slew of different hormones, which we'll look in the last little section, last little video of this section. And really the functions of the pituitary with the hypothalamus are to, again, link the nervous and endocrine systems, regulates eating, drinking, sleeping, sexual activity, really is the master control center for your sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. Also regulates all of the production of hormones in the body, helps regulate emotions and behaviors, again, controlling eating and drinking. We think that things like body weight, essentially there is a sort of a thermostat in the body, and it's in the hypothalamus. And that's why when you try to starve and lose weight, you go on an extreme diet, you end up losing weight and so forth. But then because the set point is still set at a certain level, once you maybe don't eat so strictly, you go back to a diet essentially that puts you right back up to the set point. It's also, we find that when people lose a large amount of weight, if the set point in the hypothalamus doesn't change, that the body actually, the hypothalamus puts out signals to slow down metabolism even further. because it thinks it needs to conserve energy. And that makes weight loss even more difficult. So the hypothalamus, unfortunately, is really in charge of regulating, we think, the overall kind of body mass. And that's where people have asked, so what can we do to actually change that programming? And that's where many argue that visualization is one tool that could be used for that. So visualizing yourself at your ideal body weight, not just in terms of images, but also how you would feel in that state and so forth. And we think that the whole process of visualization, making inner emotional pictures and so forth, is connected very strongly with the hypothalamus and the thalamus, and as we'll see, the epithalamus. In fact, the old view from the ancient world was that thoughts actually were not formed in the nerves, but were received by the cerebral spinal fluid and then conveyed into the nerve activity. And so is the third ventricle, which sets up this rhythm between the pineal gland and the pituitary and the hypothalamus, which was believed to be the seat of our inner picture forming capacity. And there's some evidence, again, based on the cerebral spinal fluid rhythms today, that there might be some truth to that. All right, so regulation of body mass, regulation of body temperature, and regulation of circadian rhythms. These are all important parts of the hypothalamus, and I'll show you one important nucleus in the hypothalamus called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which essentially is your internal 24-hour clock. And that's going to regulate all your other 24-hour or circadian rhythms via that. Now, a couple of things about the pituitary I'll just mention before we go into the section on that. It really has three parts. Two are considered most important. There's an anterior part called the anterior pituitary, and then a posterior lobe, and then there's a middle zone, not shown in this picture, called the intermediate lobe. In humans, we don't think that plays much of a role, although in mammals, this secretes a lot of melanocyte-stimulating hormone, which is important for coat color. So different colors of the coat, that's mediated by the intermediate lobe. But the anterior lobe secretes specific hormones, as does the posterior, and each of these lobes drains into its own little circulatory system. So you see, in the case of the anterior here, how all the hormones secreted here are going to a little circulatory system, and then this goes out into the body. Same with the posterior lobe. These hormones, again, will regulate. For example, one of the hormones that's secreted here is thyroid stimulating hormone, regulates all of your thyroid function. And what's very interesting about many of these hormones that are secreted, they are in concentrations usually between 10 to the minus 9th to 10 to the minus 12th. So nanograms or picograms, tiny. In fact, if you study homeopathy, this is a 9x or a 12x homeopathic dilution. So we can say these hormones are actually in homeopathic levels, and they can have profound effects based on just slight changes on your physiology. So it's just very interesting how that occurs. Notice in the anterior pituitary, there's a little circulatory system that brings fresh blood in, and the neurons in the hypothalamus come down and they actually synapse onto that circulatory system, and they actually secrete hormones into that system, and then that's carried down the infundibulum, and then those hormones stimulate cells in the anterior pituitary to release their hormones. So the anterior is kind of confusing. You have what's called the hypothalamic releasing hormone, which comes down, secretes into this little portal system, and then it's going to cause groups of cells in the anterior pituitary to release their hormones into the blood. So in the case of TSH, there's a hormone that's released by neurons in the hypothalamus called TRH, thyroid releasing hormone, and then that causes cells in the anterior pituitary called thyrotrophs to secrete TSH into the blood. So that's the anterior pituitary. Posterior is simpler. In fact, it only secretes two hormones, oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone. Both of these are synthesized by neurons up in the hypothalamus, and then the neuron extends an axon all the way down the infundibulum, and that synapses onto the blood vessels down here, and that releases it into the blood. So the slightly different function, and that has to do with embryologically, the pituitary arose in two parts. One was from the brain, we could say a neural part, and then the other part came from the oral mucosa. So really when these two parts came together, we get the anterior and posterior pituitary. So they have different interconnections based on that. Okay, so that's a little on the hypothalamus and pituitary. In the next slide, I'll just show you some of the major nuclei that we find in the hypothalamus. So here's a picture, cross-section of the major hypothalamic nuclei. Again, I'm not going to ask you to memorize all these, but you should know a little bit about what they do and their major function. So very roughly, we can divide it into anterior, posterior, and then medial and lateral. So this is looking from the side, this is looking from head-on cross-section. So if we look at the anterior hypothalamic nucleus, that's going to be in the front portion here of the hypothalamus. This is really where your parasympathetic nervous system is regulated, and that's going to regulate temperature, especially heat dissipation. So lesions to this area actually result in hyperthermia. Not hypothermia, but hyperthermia, overheating. So that's going to help regulate cooling down. We can say that's sort of a cooling center. So that's the anterior hypothalamic nucleus. And then if we go downwards, we have an area called the preoptic area. And that is shown, that's going to be right above the eyes. So not shown in this picture, the optic nerves are coming in right here. And so the preoptic area is right here in the orange. And that is cells here release a hypothalamic releasing hormone called GnRH, gonadotropin releasing hormone. And this is going to actually stimulate the anterior pituitary to release what are called gonadotropins, FSH and LH. And this is going to regulate in females the menstrual cycle, and in males testicular and sperm development. So those are your reproductive hormones. Lesions here will result in arrested sexual development, impotence, and amenorrhea. So that's the preoptic area. The supraoptic nucleus, SO, that's right here, that actually synthesizes and releases antidiuretic hormone, and that's going to be very important for water balance in the body. Antidiuresis means it prevents the loss of urine, and so ADH actually retains water. If unfortunately if you lose ADH function, you just urinate copiously, and you tend to lose a lot of electrolytes with that as well, and that's called diabetes insipidus. So that's the supraoptic nucleus. The PVN, paraventricular nucleus, that's shown here. It's more on the upper side of the hypothalamus, way up here at the top. And the PVN synthesizes oxytocin. It also synthesizes the releasing hormone for ACTH, which is what regulates your cortisol. TRH regulates your TSH and thyroid. And then again, ADH and somatostatin, which is more of an inhibiting neurotransmitter. So oxytocin is the big one here. Suprachiasmatic nucleus, SCN, I mentioned that. And that is actually found way in the front here, in this little region here, and it's connected to the optic nerves. There are little fibers that connect back and forth. The SCN is your, as I mentioned before, is your primary circadian clock. So it regulates all of your body rhythms, your 24-hour rhythms. So a lot of these hormones we'll see from the hypothalamus and pituitary are actually released in a 24-hour rhythm. And they are, some of them like thyroid and the ACTH, which regulates cortisol, is highest in the morning, and then they go down in the afternoon. So that's the suprachiasmatic nucleus. The dorsal medial nucleus, this one is your, when you stimulate it, leads to inhibition of appetite. So the dorsal medial nucleus, you see that right here, these regions in yellow. So this is towards the medial side, and so this is going to be responsible for obesity if it's overstimulated. If you lose that center, like through a lesion, you get the opposite, and you lose weight. The posterior hypothalamic nucleus stimulates your sympathetic nervous system, so this is your warming center, and lesions here result in what's called poikilothermia, or poor thermal regulation. The lateral hypothalamic area, so on the sides, LHA, this is going to also be involved in appetite. This is your feeding center. So when you stimulate this, there's increased eating. So you can think of the lateral nucleus causes you to grow laterally, and this is the source of orexin. Lesions here would result in starvation. And then the mammillary body, MB, if we look up at the picture here, mammillary body is right back here. The mammillary body is going to be often affected in chronic alcoholism. This causes what's called Wernicke encephalopathy or Korsakoff psychosis, so confusion, amnesia, ataxia, which is an uncoordinated gait. It's also involved in memory with the hippocampus. And so this is an extremely important area. And again, we think that what happens in chronic alcoholism is that chronic B1 deficiency, so alcoholism causes B1 deficiency, can damage parts in the mammillary body here. Ventral medial nucleus, this is the other area that's involved in appetite. This is your so-called satiety center. So stimulation here would result in decreased eating. We can think the ventral medial nucleus causes you to shrink immediately, whereas the lateral again causes you to gain weight. Lesions here would then result in loss of disinhibition and you get obesity or hyperphagia, or what we call savage eating behavior. People just eat anything, not even food. There's case examples of people having strokes that affected this region, and they, from that point on, just try to put everything in their mouth. And then the arcuate nucleus, AN, this is going to actually produce hypothalamic releasing and inhibiting factors. They're going to act on the anterior pituitary. In particular, it inhibits prolactin, we'll see in the next little video, from the hypothalamus via dopamine. So this is the source of dopamine, which inhibits the anterior pituitary. So that's a lot of detailed information, and again, that's more just a kind of a general summary. Just understand there are these roughly 12 nuclei in the hypothalamus. They're involved in temperature regulation, either warming or cooling. The anterior hypothalamus is more your cooling center, posterior more your warming center. And then we have our lateral, more involved in gaining weight and increasing appetite, and then the medial areas more involved in satiety and weight loss. And then things like the suprachiasmatic nucleus, your circadian clock, and the mammillary bodies damaged in alcoholism, but are involved in memory and different emotional connection with memory. So those are some of the most important areas here to think about. The last part of the diencephalon is the pineal gland. This is the most dorsal portion, it's a superior portion of the diencephalon. It's part of the epithalamus, and it's really at the center of the brain. And so if we look at the picture here, this shows you pretty clearly. We have the third ventricle here with the thalamus, and this little thing here is what actually is the bridge that connects the two halves of the thalamus together. Here is the hypothalamus, and then the infundibulum and the pituitary down here. Here's the medulla, the pons. Here's the midbrain. You can see from the third ventricle down, there's a cerebral aqueduct going through the midbrain and then going into the fourth ventricle, and then eventually narrowing down into the central canal, and some of it then goes out into the meninges. That's going to be the cerebral spinal fluid there. And then we have the colliculi, remember, at the back side of the midbrain, and then hanging out right down here between the two superior colliculi is the pineal gland. This whole region that's attached to it is called the epithalamus. So some people equate the pineal with the epithalamus, but it's really not technically the same. It's really the most posterior portion of the epithalamus. So that's the pineal. So notice that it's nowhere connected to, a lot of people talk about the pineal as the third eye. And that's partly because in animals like certain fish and especially reptiles, the pineal, the cortex is very thin, and the skull actually comes right over, and the pineal is right underneath the skull. In fact, some of these reptiles have a photosensitive area of cells right here, which are connected to the pineal. So they can sense light and so forth in the environment through the pineal. We don't have that capacity. However, through a very complicated pathway, when light comes in and we see blue light through the retinas, only blue light, so the blue of the sky, it's going to activate certain nerves in the suprachiasmatic nucleus, that one center in the hypothalamus. From there, nerves will actually go down the brainstem, and they will come out in the neck, in what's called the cervical spine. and then they will synapse onto other nerves that go back up into the brain, and they'll actually synapse onto the pineal gland. Sounds super complicated and confusing. And part of the reason for this is the way these structures have evolved evolutionarily. So it goes to this convoluted factor. Well, what's the point of all this? Well, because of that blue light, when it hits the retinas, it'll activate this nerve pathway, and it will actually inhibit the pineal gland's secretion of melatonin. So exposure to blue light turns off the pineal. The pineal normally secretes melatonin, and the melatonin actually helps to get you into a sleep cycle. It has a lot of other roles. Melatonin is also secreted into the cerebral spinal fluid, and it's going to bathe actually the whole brain in melatonin, and it acts as a very potent antioxidant to the brain. Melatonin also regulates your digestive function and a lot of other areas around the body, so it gets into the blood and has effects there. It's a little complicated with melatonin because it turns out the intestines secrete 400 times or more the amount of melatonin that the brain secretes. And in fact, certain foods have melatonin, like cherries and things like that, and that actually, a lot of vegetables, and that increases blood melatonin levels. But interestingly, the pineal melatonin is only secreted into the cerebral spinal fluid. You don't get from your digestive tract, very little of that melatonin gets into the CSF. And the pineal melatonin is released in a circadian 24-hour rhythm. And that is really regulated by the suprachiasmatic nucleus. So the SCN, that internal clock, is helping to regulate through this weird nerve pathway the pineal secretions. So humans don't have direct access of the pineal to the outside world, but they do through this nerve pathway, especially towards light. There's evidence in other mammals like polar seals that the pineal is also a warmth sensing organ, not just light, but it senses warmth. And so many have talked about the pineal as actually a receptor for higher impulses from the spiritual world, from other images. So when we cultivate the meditative practices which activate the diencephalon, I alluded to that in the Egyptian mystery schools, how the Eye of Horus really is an image of these structures. If you cultivate this and open up the pineal gland in that way, it's thought that we can then receive different information. We can talk about the pineal later. I'm not going to go into too much depth on it. A lot of people, as they get older, their pineal undergoes a process of calcification. And the pineal calcification, interestingly, causes a loss of secretion of melatonin, and that can severely interrupt sleep rhythm. So as we get older, a lot of people have poorer sleep, we think because of the loss of melatonin from the pineal. I should say that the pineal also, we now know, secretes other hormones. In particular, one hormone known as dimethyltryptamine. So serotonin is the precursor to melatonin. It's also a precursor to dimethyltryptamine. DMT is the primary hallucinogenic molecule in ayahuasca. And so, curiously, we actually secrete a little DMT into the cerebral spinal fluid, and many have argued that some of the near-death experiences or the incredible imagery people get at death or near death is a result of the pineal releasing massive amounts of DMT into the system. That's kind of a materialistic explanation for why we get these things. But I think it's interesting that we do know that the pineal secretes that. Neurophysiologically, a lot of people don't think it does. The level is so small that it probably doesn't do very much. But again, we saw with the hormones that those levels are incredibly small and they can have profound effects on different body functions. So there's probably a role here for DMT. Recently, it was discovered that the pineal also secretes some sex hormones like estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone. And it has an inhibitor, an MAO inhibitor, which prevents the breakdown of dimethyltryptamine. So very interesting, and I think as we get better and better assays for detecting these things, we're probably going to find a whole slew of pineal hormones. Okay, so that's a little bit about the pineal gland and its connections with the hypothalamus via the suprachiasmatic nucleus and outer light rhythms. One final thing I'll say is that, again, blue light specifically suppresses melatonin, but if we have red or orange light, that actually doesn't suppress melatonin. So before you go to bed, that's where it's often said you shouldn't look at blue light because that will suppress your melatonin. But a candle or the old-time incandescent lights, they're more red-orange. Those are fine. The modern compact fluorescents, though, are very blue. And looking at a computer screen, that's often blue. And so that can be a real problem. And so now there are actually computer apps that will gradually make your screen more and more red before bedtime, and that can help with sleep potentially. So that's the pineal gland. The pineal gland is one of several organs that we call the circumventricular organs, or CVOs. And these are brain structures with very highly permeable capillaries. So here there's no blood-brain barrier. So these are portions of the brain that can directly sense the blood. These are usually structures around the third and the fourth ventricles. They come directly into contact with both blood and CSF. So super important for neuroendocrine function. And we can divide them into sensory CVOs or secretory CVOs. So sensory CVOs sense signals in the blood, and then they send information to the autonomic, the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. So one of them is called the area postrema, and that's really the region we talked about here in the medulla, which is right up against the cerebral spinal fluid in the fourth ventricle, and it is triggered by different changes in the CSF, and so that will trigger vomiting if those changes occur. There's something called the subfornical organ, which is up here in the third ventricle, and that is related to energy homeostasis, but also osmoregulation, which is regulation of pretty much salt in the blood, and then cardiovascular regulation. And then the vascular organ of the lamina terminalis. And that's found here, and that's going to help regulate blood osmolarity, which again is electrolyte concentration, primarily sodium. So those are sensory CVOs, and then there are secretory CVOs. They actually secrete hormones and glycoproteins, which act as hormones. Remember, those are sugar proteins, into the blood from the brain. And that would be the SCO, the subcommissural organ, and that's also involved, that's depicted here. That's involved in osmoregulation again, aldosterone secretion, which is one of your main hormones from your adrenal gland, which regulates blood pressure, and then detoxification of the CSF. The pituitary we've already talked about, that's considered a CVO. And then the median eminence, this is the inferior portion of the hypothalamus right down here. And that's involved in regulation of some of those pituitary hormones. And then finally, the pineal gland is a CVO. So this is important because, again, these are additional neuroendocrine regulatory organs, very important for regulation of homeostasis. All right, so that covers it pretty much for the diencephalon. And we'll have a separate little section here on the pituitary, and that'll wrap up the general introduction to the brain.